In this video, we're going to add something that's called easing to our animation. And this will create a much more realistic ball bouncing motion. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to my bottom right here, and I'm going to zoom out of my timeline so I can see everything. There we are. And we're going to take a look at each one of these animations separately. The first one I'm going to take a look at is this ball dropping down to the ground, this first transition strip right here. I'm just going to select that. Now, currently, everything is moving in what's called linear motion. That means it's not varying in its rate of speed from the time it starts to the time it ends. And really, nothing works that way. Nothing in real life works in a strictly linear motion. By adding a little bit of easing, we can create the illusion of actual air resistance and gravity. I want you to imagine this ball as it's at the top of its arc here. It's going to begin falling at a slow rate of speed, but it's going to pick up speed as it nears the ground until it's going fairly quickly. That sort of animation is called an ease in because it's easing in to its animation. How do we specify that? Well, you'll notice that we have a little chart here and it's called easing linear. I'm going to click on that though. And remember I said we want to create something that's called an ease in. And here is our ease in property. If I click on that, you can see that we have a number of different flavors of easing in. And we have a graph over here that expresses how that is actually working. Whenever the graph is close to horizontal, that means that there's very little change. And what we're seeing here is a slow, gradual increase in speed until it starts to go up quite high. If we click on some of these other options here, we can see that the rate of speed changes so that it holds its slow position longer and then more quickly goes into its descent. And if I click on some of these others, you can see that that rate changes depending on what I'm clicking on. What I would like you to do is I'm just going to keep this at cubic. I think that's a nice rate of change for our ease in for the ball drop. Let's create the corresponding easing for the ball bouncing up. So if I scrub this down here, you can almost see as I scrub through here that it's taking longer for it to start its animation, and then it picks up speed and hits the ground and then compresses and then bounces back up. For the bouncing back up, it's going to have the opposite effect. It's going to start rather quickly and then bounce up, and it's going to slow as it reaches the apex of its bounce. So that is called an ease out. I select that transition strip, come back over to my easing graph, click that, and I'm going to say ease out. So what that's showing us is that it's moving fairly quickly and then it's going to slow. Remember, as this graph nears horizontal, that means it's a slow rate of change as it's coming up here. Hey, well, let's take a look and see what that looks like. I'm going to hit Command Return on my keyboard. Let's get it to run again. Watch how it slowly falls into its drop and picks up speed, and as it hits the ground, it quickly bounces back up and then slows back into its final resting spot. Hey, there we go. Now, we could add some easing to our squash and stretch down here, but I have a feeling it's happening too quickly for it to really register. So we're not going to bother with that just right now. So we now have a ball that is easing into its fall, hits the ground, and then eases out of its rise back up into its final position. That is the wonderful world of easing, and we're just scratching the surface. As you can see that there are many other types of easing that we haven't yet explored. Now, the next thing I want to do in this video is try to get this ball to loop its animation. Currently, it plays through its animation once, the ball drops, hits the ground, comes back up, and then stops. But in the demo, we saw that the ball was continually bouncing. So how do we do that? Well, we are going to introduce a rather large topic, but we're going to do it in a very simple way. And that is the topic of timeline triggers. And that is simply basically saying that whenever the current time indicator reaches a certain point on our timeline, we are going to trigger something to happen. Like I say, this is sort of a big topic, but it's going to be interesting, and it's something that we are going to revisit again and again. I'm going to basically put a trigger on our timeline that tells this animation to loop over and over and over again. How we do that is I'm going to take my current time indicator, and I'm going to reposition it to the end of our animation, right over top of our last keyframe here. And you can see that's now positioned at 2 seconds, 0.099. That 0.099 is the gap that we added in here. At this point in our timeline, we would like to be able to tell this animation to go back to the beginning. Well, how do we do that? Well, I want you to take a look over here. You see this little thing here? It looks like a keyframe inside of some curly brackets. And you can see the code when I hover over top. It says insert trigger. And then there's a keyboard shortcut for that, Command T. But the easiest way to do that is just to click on this little icon right here, and it will position a trigger where our current time indicator currently is. And you can see our trigger has been added to this point in our timeline. And we also get this dialog box, and it says trigger at, well, that's the milliseconds of our timeline. And what do we want it to do? Well, we just want it to go back and play from the beginning. And this is, like I say, this is a large topic, and this is something that Edge Animate does very well. It allows us to access things like code and timeline controls in a very graphical and easily understood way. I'm going to just click on playback. I'm going to click on play. Just let me resize this a little bit so we can see all our window. And I'm going to click play. And I'm going to click stage. In fact, I'm going to double click stage. When I double click stage, you can see that a little bit of code has been created for us. Sim, that's short for symbol, and we'll talk about symbols in just a moment, dot play, parentheses, and a semicolon. That is some very simple code for us to deal with, and all that is doing is telling the timeline that when it gets to this point, to go back to the beginning and play it all over again. Well, let's see if this is working for us. I'm going to hit Command Return on my keyboard, or File drop down, Preview in Browser. And there we go. We have our looping animation. A single ball drop, but the timeline has that trigger that says when it gets to the end of that animation, go play it again. And so now this ball will bounce forever. In our next video, we're going to add some controls that will allow us to control this timeline with some buttons.